a foreign language, you have to learn the digital language because the digital language operates with certain rules, like visuals matters more than text. It's
Yes.
clear that it matters. So you need to operate the visual to understand how to work with images, with clips, which now with AI is quite interesting. You have to understand the role of emotions. Emotions are so crucial online. And what it
Yes.
makes it so bad is that negative emotions um, travel better, travel faster than positive emotions. But as a diplomat, you cannot operate with negative emotions if you want to breed bridges, if you want to create a positive environment for work. So, but
Mhm.
you need to understand how to navigate into an environment full of in which negative emotions dominate. We keep
Mm.
talking about state engaging in diplomacy. There is a new breed of diplomatic actor emerging quite powerfully, I'm afraid. And these are private actors happening in which these private actors could be more powerful because of technology. But the idea that you can keep everything confidential, I think, is becoming a thing of the past. And what I've done, I put them in contact to converse with each other, the League of Nations with Machiavelli. And guess what? Because I was interested in the dynamic, and in 5 minutes, Machiavelli, Machiavelli was destroying the League of Nations. You are used to trust technology, used to trust science. 20 years ago, we thought, well, technology can help, can assist us, can do so. Now that trust has gone down, we see because of the dark side of and you see the backlash. This is how you basically tailored messages for Alisher profile and not for my profile. I may stop for 3 seconds a different movie. I'm going to give you information tailored to me. The traditional Ministry of Foreign Affairs is structured for the 18th century. But this kind of algorithmic manipulation could be as bad as, an attack with missiles. But without AI, you'll be, or AI, or this kind of digital technology, understanding well these kind of tools, you're going to be a serious disadvantage, which you have to build relationship. Technology cannot necessarily help you building
Right.
relationships. Are we going to see OpenAI getting a seat in the UN Security Council?
It gives me a great pleasure to introduce my today's guest, Dr. Corneliu Bjola. He is a professor of digital diplomacy at the University of Oxford and also head of Oxford Digital Diplomacy Research Group. I think he is the first ever professor of digital diplomacy at Oxford, maybe even beyond Oxford, maybe in the world. He is a very prominent scholar, especially in digital diplomacy. He has published many numerous books and articles on digital diplomacy. So it's so great to see you, Corneliu. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Alisher, for inviting me to your podcast. It's a pleasure to reconnect with you, and thank you very much for the kind introduction. Indeed, the professorship in digital diplomacy is the first one,
Right.
not only at Oxford but more generally at
Yeah.
any other university. And I think this speaks well about the fact that
Hmm.
about the role of technology in global
Right.
affairs and its impact in many areas nowadays in diplomacy. And that has been my focus
Yeah.
of teaching and research in the past 10 years.
Great. I remember last time when I was at the University of Oxford and visited your department for giving a talk. I saw you with some very modern technologies, digital devices, and I realized that you was teaching your digital diplomacy class was using very sophisticated some digital technologies.
Let me explain what I've been doing. Indeed,
Right.
so I've been trying to understand the role of technology on how diplomacy works. And we know both, the core functions of diplomacy, representation, communication, and negotiation. And I've been trying to see how various types of technology, starting with social media, later on with Zoom platforms, right?
Right.
AI nowadays affects these core functions. When you
Hmm.
visited Oxford, and I remember very well, your talk at that time, it was very well received by all our students and fellows, because you bring in always, this kind of very interesting and practical insights to the practice, to the field of diplomacy. So at that time, I started a new course, and the
Hmm.
course it was about the metaverse. So
Hmm.
I benefited from a grant from my university, and the idea here is not only to examine what is happening, social
Hmm.
media, Zoom, Teams, AI, but also what it may be on the horizon.
Hmm.
So the idea is to also look a little bit into the future, do this kind of horizon scanning. And this is when I proposed to my university, look, a number of entities, governments, and especially in the Middle East nowadays, but in other places too, that are looking to the virtual reality.
Hmm.
Virtual reality not as Zoom, but in a more immersive space, and that's the
Hmm.
metaverse. So this is where I started to teach a course on the metaverse and
Hmm.
diplomacy, which is fascinating, really
Hmm.
fascinating, because there is already literature on the role of virtual reality, and there is always there's already applications for
Hmm.
various countries. I mentioned briefly before. Last month I was in Doha in Qatar for a talk, and I had the pleasure to have a conversation with those launching the second stage of the Qatar metaverse. Guess on what? On Roblox. I don't know if you heard of Roblox. Roblox is a platform that is basically, young people who are teenagers and kids, to play. But it's very much because they reproduced
Hmm.
Doha, part of Doha in the metaverse. It was a big success. And it's
Hmm.
part of this new venue for cultural diplomacy, right? Because you basically immerse in someone else's city or culture, and you do all kind of fun activities that you do basically when you are in person. So there are many applications. So in that context, the what you saw me with the headsets at that time, the meta headsets, it's one of these exercises of horizon scanning, which I think is interesting.
Hmm.
And it's not only cultural public diplomacy, it's also peacekeeping and peace negotiation. The UN Security Council used the same type of headsets
Hmm.
in a meeting in 2022 to
Hmm.
review progress, for
Hmm.
instance, on the peacekeeping efforts, peacemaking efforts in Colombia. How the agreement was implemented. So there is kind of niche, let's say, digital diplomacy, and that's why I'm keeping an eye on what might also emerge as the next stage, or maybe as a new
Fantastic.
branch of diplomacy. And in your
Wonderful.
region as well, there are some interesting developments, actually
Hmm.
coming from Turkey,
Hmm.
because Turkey wants to create a metaverse, Turkverse. I mean, I've seen a little bit of the plans, but haven't been implemented because it costs it requires some investment infrastructure. And the Turkverse is supposed to speak to the entire Central Asian countries. So that
Hmm.
will be a very interesting development as well.
Yeah.
I wish to see if Turkey has the funds and will to continue with the project to create an interesting new space. Iran has
Wonderful.
also been involved in developing its own version of the metaverse. So there are interesting dynamics which go
Yeah.
beyond social media, which go beyond AI, and there is a new space which I found quite interesting, and I wanted to explore. And I have
Wonderful.
a paper in the works uh, covering this.
Great. Well, I'd like to congratulate you with this fundamental book. First, the Oxford Handbook of Digital Diplomacy, which was published at the beginning of this year, and you edited with Ilan Manor. So this is a absolutely wonderful book, which has 34, I believe, chapters, and I'm very happy that I'm the author of one of them. So, and I'd like to ask you how the book was received.
Four or five published reviews so far in various journals. All of them, highly positive, and understandably so. Look, I mean, digital technology. Everybody is interested in the role of technology. And it took me and Ilan some time to prepare the volume. And there is a reason for that, because when I started looking into digital diplomacy back in 2014 with the first volume, which I collaborated with another guest of your podcast, Marcus Holmes. So when we looked into that in 2014, there was not much. There was a little bit in Europe, a little bit in the United States. It was mainly about the good side, less about the dark side.
Right.
And then, we had to wait because we have this idea of creating something that is, state of the art in the field. I had to wait to have a community of scholars developing and researching from multiple angles. And it took, yes, indeed, about 8 years for this community to become active, vibrant. And that's the moment when with Ilan we decided, okay, let's approach and have a number of scholars, including yourself. And thank you very much for your contribution on Central
Thank you
Asia
for the invitation.
digital diplomacy. And this is what we try to do. So move on from a focus on Europe and North America to open up globally, Central Asia, Middle East,
Right.
other parts of China, South America, and so on, to look at new topics, trends. So to provide this kind of new view of perspective on what is happening in the digital diplomacy sphere. Now, so from this point of view, I understand, the reviews, being quite interested in understanding better. And that's a sign of maturity. When a new field like digital diplomacy, a sub-discipline emerging, a sign of maturity, a sign of the field growing, is when, yes, you have the community expanding and new ideas, circulating and you see them implemented also in practice. So that was a moment, 2022, when we decided to do this. On the downside, and that I think, transpires in some of the reviews, is that we don't have much about AI. We try to engage with our
Right.
scholars,
Right.
but that was a funny thing in a sense, because at the moment when we finished the manuscript and pushed the button to send it to Oxford University Press, and that was October 2022, guess what happened? ChatGPT emerged.
Right. Right.
Of course, we panicked, a little bit. We said, what we're going to do? And then we prepared a special. And that's a problem with this kind of work,
Yes.
because
Yes.
it dates quickly in a sense.
Right.
So you have to write constantly, and you have to write if you want to keep pace. I mean, of course, the theoretical part of it is more enduring. But you have to keep pace with technology. We cannot write nowadays like only about social media. So during the pandemic, I published a couple of articles dealing with how diplomats work on Zoom and Teams.
Right.
I interview people. I had to look at the dark side. I'm now focusing on AI, and I mentioned metaverse before. So you have to keep pace with what is going on. But technology is not linear as we got used. It has become, to a certain point, it's evolving, it's accelerating in a rather exponential manner. So things that we found fascinating 10 years ago in digital diplomacy, nowadays it's business as usual. It doesn't surprise you anymore. If we come back, let's say in 5 years or 10 years, I bet we're going to see fascinating new developments exactly in those core areas that I mentioned, representation, communication, and negotiation.
Wonderful. Very often we could see that scholars and practitioners, they have their own world. So very different, very separate world. But in your case, I believe you achieved some kinds of merge between these two worlds, because as I see you as I follow you on some social media, you have now a lot of invitation from embassies, from practitioners. You're constantly talking to practitioners, to diplomats on using digital technologies. You give them some advice, consultations, etc., etc. So the question is, how do you see difference now in the approach to digital technologies using digital diplomacy among practitioners and among scholars? Are there any common things, some differences? What would be difference if there are some differences between these two worlds?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Indeed, this is how I started, and it was a tactical move on my part. When I set up, this research group, Oxford Digital Diplomacy Research Group, the core mission was to connect the scholarly community, which was small,
Right.
with the practitioners. And this is where we started a series of events in London. We had events on a regular basis organized with various embassies in London. Then we had one in Berlin, in Brussels, and then we expanded. We even at the UN. And the point there was the following. We said, okay, we are, Alisher, a social scientist, as academics, what do we do? We do research, answering some important questions that we find interesting.
Right.
In order to do that, you require empirical data. And how do you find empirical data, historical data, statistics, interviews, and so on and so forth? Well, in the digital diplomacy, especially when the field is emerging, you need to stay close to those who are doing it. This is how, in a sense, we develop that network, that basically, and the network of sensors, to listen to what is happening. Because, it's one thing to write about digital diplomacy now as it evolving. It's another to write about after 2 or 3 years when people don't, things have moved on.
Right.
So that was the purpose, to try to engage both. We say, well, this is what we think at the scholarly community. This is how we find theoretically things evolving with public diplomacy, with international negotiations, with new developments in representation, diplomatic representation. And then the practitioners provide you feedback. Hey, yes, indeed, but we emphasize this particular element, and that's very useful for us. So we developed this community, and then, for instance, when the pandemic struck, and I started to work on this article on how diplomacy has been affected by, the conduct of diplomacy affected by Zoom and Teams. I had 105 diplomats responding to my surveys. That the community was there that I could, and it was a global community. So
Right.
that was a tactical move, and it is very important, I think, for scholars and practitioners to stay close together because they need each other.
Right.
We basically get insights for those applying these kind of approaches in their work in an experimental way, most of the case, and scholars, trying to extract theoretical insight that provides a perspective, which I think practitioners always enjoy in their work. So now, how are these two communities, getting back to your point, how are these communities seeing things? So I think there have been stages. Before, let's say, 2014, I said there was this kind of optimism, especially on the practitioner side, that things, this technology are quite interesting. There was a lot of experimentation, less professionalization, and there was also some institutional resistance at the beginning, in the sense that for a variety of reasons. One is that when they looked at these diplomats playing with Twitter and phone applications, the older diplomat, this is not real diplomacy. This is just superfluous. That doesn't count. And of
Right.
course, that affected, the younger diplomats who were what we call digital natives, growing up with this kind of tools in their private life, and now, importing them, some of them,
Younger generation, right?
the younger generation, importing them in their professional life. And they were not particularly pleased because then there is no promotion based on the work that you do online and this kind. So there was a lot of experimentation. But then you have this kind of external shocks coming, like the Arab Spring, when
Right.
people realize something important in Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that what happens online doesn't stay online. It has offline repercussions. And if you
Mm.
don't have a digital presence, you don't know what is happening.
Mhm.
You may understand, and that's happening again now with AI, by the way. So
Mm.
with social media, you need to develop a social presence to have to understand a little bit, what is happening online, what is trending, what is not trending. Not everything that is trending it's important, but nevertheless, it gives you some insight. So this is when we see a little bit of professionalization on behalf of Ministry of Foreign Affairs with training, with strategies, with strategic thinking, how to build this. Now, that was a period in which things were expected to go well, but then you have the dark side emerging.
Mm.
Disinformation, fake news.
Right.
Remember ISIS, Daesh in 2015, which was the first one using this social media in a very destructive ways.
Mm.
And then things started to change also. The optimists turned into some sort of reservation. How are we going to operate in this kind of digital sphere, which is filled with trolls and fake news and so on? It's become more difficult, but that means that you need to adapt. You need to adapt in terms of learning new skills, how to recognize, how to navigate, to what extent you react to trolls, how to combat. I mean, in the book, for instance, that you mentioned, we have in the first chapter, I introduced this grammar rules of digital diplomacy. The
Mhm.
grammar rules in speaking that in the same way that you learn English, French, Chinese, as a foreign language, you have to learn the digital language because the digital language operates with certain rules, like visuals matters more than text. It's
Yes.
clear that it matters. So you need to operate the visual to understand how to work with images, with clips, which now with AI is quite interesting. You have to understand the role of emotions. Emotions are so crucial online. And what it
Yes.
makes it so bad is that negative emotions um, travel better, travel faster than positive emotions. But as a diplomat, you cannot operate with negative emotions if you want to breed bridges, if you want to create a positive environment for work. So, but
Mm.
you need to understand how to navigate into an environment full of in which negative emotions dominate. There is also the question of what we see nowadays with algorithmic governance, in which you
Mm.
have very tailored messages for better or for worse, for better meaning public diplomacy that we can actually present, worse being for worse being the what's happening with weaponization of these networks. And there is also what I consider now quite important, and this is something that I really take a interest in, is the hybridization in which online and offline become
Right.
merged. So we used to think, okay, I'm going to do my diplomacy in person, right? To go meet with people and so on, and that's one thing. And the other thing, I'm going to go in front of the computer, type something on Twitter, and so that's another thing. Now, what
Mhm.
I'm saying is that digital technologies and the online and the offline are merging, and that creates an interesting dynamic. So, for instance, when you work on a draft communique, right, you may use ChatGPT to export some nuances, but you have to be careful about what information you put into ChatGPT because it's confidential. You don't want to do that. And then, that draft is circulated on Google Drive or whatever, something in which others contribute to this. And all these affordances, digital affordances changes. What it changes? It changes, for instance, the time compresses. You don't need to meet in big meetings, schedule them now in 2 weeks. It compresses the time for doing a lot of work. It rewards those who have the skills to do this faster. And that changes a little bit the hierarchy inside of the institution. I've seen that in the case of the Zoom meetings in that article, in which those who are actually very good in conducting Zoom negotiations were some young people, not the senior, which were a little bit clumsy until they learned how to operate. But in the in-person meeting, the seniors have different
Mhm. Very interesting.
approaches, and so The online and offline has this kind of interesting way at this point in which they intersect with each other, and it creates, and we have to look at that. So the idea that we can compartmentalize, and separate the two is probably that's the childhood phase. We are now in the teenager, maybe adult phase, in which things are moving quite fast from this point of view. And that's an interesting aspect when we talk about the evolution of technology. One thing is how to capture theoretically this. And there are two different theories that I've been examining recently. So one, you have this kind of tipping point. Tipping point theory that comes from a book that was written Jay Gold, I think it was in 2000 or something, in which says, things accumulate in the system, right, incrementally, and at some point, they create a breakthrough. And I've been wondering whether that could also count for this kind of online-offline integration in the way in which you have social media, we have Teams and Zoom, we have AI, we have, at some point, things will change. That will be a perspective, right? Attempt in which, and I want to understand this game-changing perspective. That's part of my research at the moment, right? Especially with AI. How effectively, what exactly is going to change more radically? And what, on the entire profession of diplomacy may I'm not saying will disappear. I'm saying that will be altered in various ways. Recruitment in diplomatic profession is to be based on what? On having a good knowledge of history, political economy, political science. Is that still enough? I think are still good elements today, right? In order to understand the global context. But I think without this kind of digital component, you are at a serious disadvantage. So there is something to reflect on that. So have we reached the tipping point? At the moment, no. But so that's something that I've been trying to understand better.
Very interesting. What would be in the future? We could just guess. Perhaps it would be something unbelievably fascinating, interesting, and challenging things. But coming back to nowadays, can we say that digital technologies already have a profound impact on diplomacy? Or it's hard to say so?
It has and it hasn't. Depends on what we are talking about. So, for instance, if we go with the second function, diplomatic function, communication has a big impact. It starts with social media. A lot of communication now is done online, for better or for worse. Usually, when I start my class on digital diplomacy, I come with this painting of the Peace of Westphalia negotiation treaty. It's a famous painting with all kinds of people, Westphalia 1648, which international relations, it's considered to be a very momentous, a crucial moment, the birth of the sovereign state. And then I say, well, let's look at this picture, which you have this kind of, all of them men at that time, right? With very tough colors, this kind of medieval dressing and so on. So let's look at this picture. It took about 5 years at that time, Peace of Westphalia, to be negotiated. So if they have digital technology, what would have been different? And the people start, let's see. And then you start to get a sense, because decision is faster, right? You have to react to a lot of things that happen faster. You may say, I'm going to ignore. It's your choice to ignore. The problem is that if we ignore things, may affect you anyway. So you have to pay attention, and you have to decide what to react to, because you cannot react to everything. So on one hand, we have an influence on decision making, especially on the way in which you take decisions. The idea that you can spend like Peace of Westphalia 5 years to negotiate a treaty, well, there was also the transportation issue at that time, all kind of things. The other aspect is that in the Peace of Westphalia, who was negotiating? You have the head of the states, and they have this conversation among themselves, and that was it. Nowadays, it's not. I mean, if you talk about the war in Ukraine, or the Middle East, is the general public heavily involved in the conversation online and has offline repercussions through
impacts
protest
them.
movements in American universities or European, right? So it's no longer, and the public and the elites have to react to that. That's something that didn't exist, in the Peace of
Yes.
Westphalia, and in which, again, it affects decision making because of that. So the circle of participants in the negotiation has expanded for better or for worse. There is also, I think, the question of ratification nowadays. And I mentioned Robert Putnam. With Ilan, we published an article some time ago. Robert Putnam speaks about how negotiations happens, right? You have the two-level negotiation, level one, international, in which these people go and talk, and then you have to go back
Yes.
to your country to ratify the deal. And you need a win set, an overlap between your agreement at level one and your agreement at level two. What is acceptable in your society? The perfect example is Brexit. If you remember, Boris Johnson, no, Theresa May went to Brussels. Beautiful agreement at the international level, level one with Brussels, came back, failed in the parliament 3 times. No
Yes.
win set. 3 times because there was a divergence between these two. Boris Johnson came, lot of support in the domestic, right? Exactly the opposite. The Brussels was not particularly happy with anything, and it was almost derailed. You remember that. So what I'm saying with the digital now, that you basically in the pre-digital age, you already have this dynamic. Now, with the digital age, your information space can be penetrated by countries that want your deal to derail. So it affects your level two. So, for instance, and we have an article, I think, on that, not written by me, when Netherlands was negotiating a treaty after 2017-18 with Ukraine, an association agreement, lots of interference in the domestic sphere of Netherlands to oppose the deal, and that came from Russia at that time. So level two, the weaponization of level two. If you want to derail deals at level two, now with the digital, you can actually interfere into that. So you may say, well, how is that change? It affects your decision making. It compresses the time. It opens up to multiple actors, and you cannot control these audiences. Sometimes they are very volatile. You see, the pressure that existed with the Gaza war and also Ukraine war in various cases. It makes your life more difficult as a negotiator, because sometimes it's not only about these constituencies, but also the weaponization of the information against you. These parties that really want your deal to fail. And you have to protect yourself against this. So there is a little bit on that. There is communication where we don't see yet a lot of involvement of digital. It's in the diplomatic representation side. So the ambassadors are still flesh and blood. Embassies are still building. Although this is changing, has my interest in the metaverse, in the sense that we have a number of embassies appearing on different platforms virtually. I think that was one, and also countries, which was the country Tuvalu. That because of the rising sea levels, the country is likely to disappear in the next 34 years. And they launched a program in which they create a digital twin, a digital replica of the entire island. And you can see progress that is moving now in order to preserve the memory of that island, that then can not only as photos, not only as movies, but as an environment in you using this kind of headsets can navigate and see the buildings and see the people and so on. So I don't know whether that will work, for embassies in terms of the representation, but there is something to look at. And maybe the new version, not only virtual reality, but augmented reality may also change. I'm also looking into augmented reality because of the glasses produced by Meta, powered by AI, and so on. And that's particularly interesting to see how representation may. Imagine if you go to an embassy wearing these kind of glasses, and then you can get a lot of information about the history of the building automatically, about all kind of other things that are, or a message from the ambassador the moment you cross into the building, enter the building, because of the way in which the geolocation works. So I mean, there's been a lot of impact. And there is a question to what extent also it was positive or negative. And that's the problem with the half full, half empty part of the glass,
Right,
depending
absolutely.
on who you ask.
Yeah. How would you see the future of diplomatic negotiation? So, do you see digitalization would be totally dominated in diplomatic negotiation, or it would be some space for just face-to-face, more secret negotiation? That's a one thing. The other thing, also, I'd like to know your opinion. There are some more powerful countries, less powerful countries. So, how digital technologies using by diplomats in their negotiation would affect this power asymmetry?
Thank you. Very crucial points. And I've been asked about these 2 points, these questions, in the past few months, quite a lot. So let's take them one by one. One, it's about the issue of confidentiality in the negotiations
Right.
and the diplomatic work. So why do we need confidentiality? Confidentiality for a couple of reasons. One is because you need a space in which you can trust the other side of working on particular issues. That protects the space from grandstanding, right? Diplomats sometimes go and they want to look tough in front of the media, in front of the audiences, and because of looking tough, that of course endangers or undermines the possibility of reaching an agreement. So having a space in which you can talk without, grandstanding, it's important. So that's one element. And of course, there is also an issue of how confidentiality could be maintained or reached, especially in very difficult circumstances, conflict, war, when people don't trust each other, right? And they may use intentionally leaks to undermine the position of the other side. So the dynamic of maintaining that type of confidentiality, it's important. And that has been the bread and butter of many negotiations in the past, right? With resistance. Remember World War One, all kinds of secret treaties, and then after World War One, they say, well, enough with that. Secret treaties are the ones, Woodrow Wilson, secret treaties are the ones that brought us to this point. We need transparency. We need people to understand because they bear the price or the cost of those treaties. But there is a balance here. The way in which we deal with that confidentiality, and then there is scrutiny in the parliament or the Congress, in certain committees to make sure that things are not totally out of the loop. But there is a question nowadays: to what extent confidentiality is still feasible with technology? Not because you have this kind of intelligence services monitoring with Pegasus and all kind of other spyware your phone, but even as we talk, as we do right now, which are talking, right? I mean, there is a question which is open, right? It is public in the open space. To what extent confidentiality becomes a thing of the past? What I mean by that is that technology is developing, especially AI, to the point in which you can understand the other side very well. And you can use this insight to steer the negotiation to your advantage.
Mhm.
One case study that I'm working on now, it's a historical case. It's the Yalta Conference from 1945.
Yeah,
Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. Very important one. And why
yeah,
I'm looking at it? Because I have full information. All the correspondence, all the treaties, all the reports are fully available online. There is a Yale website that publishes it. And then you can put them into AI.
Mhm.
And I'm trying to understand, for instance, do semantic analysis, whether
Mhm.
nuances in the
Mhm.
text changes. Semantic analysis about the meaning of words, not only the synthetic, how words come, semantic
Very.
meaning of words. Do I see a sense of a change of tone in Roosevelt or over time?
Mhm.
Is that reliable signal? What
Hmm.
about the body language? Because there is a branch of AI which is called the emotional affective intelligence, which is exploding right now, in which they look at your body language. Are you bluffing or not? So in that type of thing. So you can get this insight as an experienced diplomat. Yeah, you takes about 10 years, 20 years to understand, to read the room, to have
Right.
that time. Well, with AI nowadays, you may get to the point in which they can offer you very interesting insight that can assist you with your negotiations.
Yeah. Quickly.
So the point that the partner in your negotiation is telling you, look, I'm going to be very tough on this point. I'm not going to accept. And then you look at your AI assistant. Is it real or not? Because what the AI can do is to look at your level 2. To what extent there is public support in your country for that position. And then, right, big social media, newspapers, that type of insight that can extract rapidly. Is his position very solid as he claims, or is something that is not particularly strong? So you have this kind of data points that you can integrate into a system. This is what I'm trying to do with Yalta, because I can prove in a historical case a model and then to test it in a different real case, whether Ukraine or Israel, Gaza, and so on. You can test it and refine it. But you start with the historical case because you have full data and you know the outcome. And that's how, in a sense, you try to see whether the model
Unbelievable.
approximates. And then the model you try to apply to current events and try to refine to what extent, provide. No model is 100%, but the point is that it can influence your negotiation. And that takes me to the second question, right? Once, let's say that AI and some party develop this kind of AI capacity, and rest assured, governments are working on this. I know for the various ministries are working to develop this kind of capacity. So once you develop this kind of capacity, Alisher, would you like to negotiate with me anymore? Because you know that I have an advantage. You may say, well, be very confident in your professional skills, which you already, you have a lifelong experience with negotiating, and say, well, I'm going to defeat the machine, the man in the machine, because you're not only the machine. Or you're going to how are you going to react knowing that everything what doing is being interpreted, right? The way you smile, the way you move your hands, the way that are you going to what kind of skills in order to fool the machine, in a sense, so there is a different environment in which you're going to operate. And that's the point of the digital divide, right? Who has the capacity to do this kind? Because with AI and this kind of new technologies, these are not social media. This is not a tweet that you can tweet. It requires capacity, client investment, resources, money to do this. And of course, it's not only about negotiations. Think about crisis, anticipating crisis, tipping points. Again, Ministry of Foreign Affairs are working on this as well for a long time with mixed results. But there is speak about tipping point. There is a point in which things are moving in the direction in which this kind of digital technologies become your right arm,
Mm. Mhm.
indispensable in order to
Mm.
perform. I'm not saying that you as a diplomat, as a human, are going to be replaced. We are far away from this, far away, because there is, human contact, human engagement. But without AI, you'll be, or AI, or this kind of digital technology, understanding well these kind of tools, you're going to be a serious disadvantage. I should also add another interesting development. We keep talking about state engaging in diplomacy. There is a new breed of diplomatic actor emerging quite powerfully, I'm afraid. And these are private actors. In the past, you've seen mercenaries, Wagner type, and so on in the military field. Now we see a different type of private actor. There is an industry of influence industry, private actors operating, influencing elections. Think about Cambridge Analytica. But in the diplomatic field, we have the tech companies or private actors like Elon Musk. I don't know if you've seen, after the election in November, Elon Musk is going everywhere. When President-elect Trump is there, Musk is next to him, meeting with the Prime Minister of Italy, But it speaks about the role of the companies that have power more than states or group of
Right.
states.
Yeah.
Musk now, there is a debate in United States, in UK, wants to fund parties, political parties, and to switch or to change the political dynamic in a country, in UK. So there is something interesting happening in which these private actors could be more powerful because of technology,
Right.
and that highlights a few other things that with technology, there is power, and we have to understand how this power changing at the
Yeah.
global
Yeah.
level.
Yeah. I agree. I agree.
And
Yeah.
so, well, that's to summarize this point in a sense. Yes, I think we confidentiality is still desirable, especially in critical moment, to get the ball rolling. If you always perform in form of the audience, things will not probably move. But the idea that you can keep everything confidential, I think, is becoming a thing of the past. So you have to operate under the premise, under the understanding that sooner or later, whatever you talk there, sooner, not later, actually, is going to transpire because now the technology is there to open source intelligence and so on uh, to figure out even before you understand what is happening things.
Yeah.
So on January 8th, I'm convening here on Oxford a workshop exactly on this topic, the use of open source intelligence and AI in international negotiations. So bringing these three together, we have a number of scholars from Europe, from United States.
Very interesting.
That's a new type of project, and my new DPhil student, that it's researching this open source because you have the data. So I'm not talking about James Bond confidential information. I'm not interested in it. That's not my open source social data that you can find available now. It's 90% of the insight that you require in a negotiation. AI, because AI, as I mentioned in the case of Yalta, can give you a lot of insight if you have the proper models. And how is that going to affect international negotiations? That's, I think, will be the next probably interesting aspect to look at as we move forward, not only from the academic field, but also the practitioner. Interestingly, the participants we have for the auction part sort of mixed with the foot in
Yeah.
both.
Using technology could also affect and change somehow this power asymmetry as well.
Yeah, and we've seen that with social media. Social media initially was very much embraced by small and medium-sized countries because it could punch diplomatically above the weight in public diplomacy, for instance. With the metaverse, are not the Europeans or the Americans or even Asian countries. There is one Asian country, South Korea. Those who are very volatile metaverse are Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and South Korea.
Yeah,
Different type of cluster. Different
that's
type of
very
cluster.
interesting.
Now, in the I think, speaking about asymmetry, it may be countries, but I think we should look also how this power asymmetry, it's as technology moves, It's evolving and empowering non-state actors in relation with states, and with digital diplomacy, as we move forward, we mentioned social media, we mentioned platforms, we mentioned AI, we mentioned metaverse. There is one new element which is part of a new it's space technology. All these
Yes.
mini satellites. It's
Yeah.
a crazy dynamic at the moment in which after Musk created that network, all others, Europe, United States, and also trying to catch up because that's the digital infrastructure, part of the digital infrastructure, these mini satellites together with many other aspects. So there is you don't get bored with digital technology because there is always a new block, a new element
Yes.
emerging. So focusing,
Absolutely.
yes, social media was a big one, and it still is. AI, but space is
Who
becoming a
knows what
very
would be
interesting.
next? Yeah.
Space is
You
very
know,
interesting. Not mentioning quantum computing, which is a
yes.
little bit farther away, but that will be another game changer.
You know, I teach negotiation, and I and my students we do negotiate with different kinds of AI chatbots. And of course, perhaps there are many type of technologies, but from my experience at this moment, perhaps in the future would be different picture, but at this moment, chatbots are not very effective in negotiating. So, for example, when I press them, when I do some very tough kinds of bargaining, usually you could see they are giving up at this point. But I don't know what would be tomorrow. Of course, they could also learn and change very fast. Uh, but now,
No, you're right. You're right. I mean, with the chatbots have been very much deployed in consular affairs. In order to get information about visas, there is a problem of human resources. The more redundant the work is, easy to delegate it or to apply different other tools. So if you look probably consular affairs and during the pandemic when people try to find information, what kind
yes.
of visa restriction chatbots could prove quite useful. Now, when we talk about chatbots, ChatGPT type of thing, I don't think they're there yet, and probably there's restrictions to be
Mhm.
used internal or external. Internal in the sense that you don't want to give too much information, which is confidential to certain things. Where they can work, and I tested them a couple of times, is for training.
Mhm.
So, in a sense, you have a scenario of how to negotiate a particular treaty, like a crisis, let's say, like a crisis. And I suggest a couple of options. And what I found interesting is that I can get fairly reliable, if fairly viable insight when you combine options. But again, ChatGPT doesn't work in the same way. You need to learn how to program it. There is a sequence of steps that you need to take in order to tell the ChatGPT who you are, from what point of are you a Uzbek diplomat, are you an American diplomat, what is the context in which you operate. I need, to resolve this kind of cyber attack crisis, which has this kind of repercussion, this kind of severity, and I need, a plan to work with my allies or not, and I need, this plan to be deployed in. So from this point of view, if you program it properly, it can give you insight, good insight, not to conduct negotiation on behalf of you, but to provide training, to put you in different situations. Let's say that I have to encounter negotiation with a very tough negotiator.
Mhm.
I can do that with the person and so on, but I can replay some important negotiations in the past. Um, and the ability is, there is a platform which is second last popular after ChatGPT, is called Character AI, in which you can create your own characters. So imagine that you can feed the character with information. I try to do the same, for instance, with the League of Nations, the precursors of
Mhm.
the UN. So I
Mhm.
took a lot of materials from the League of Nations, fed them to, and they started to talk exactly like the League of Nations. You need that kind of verbose, statements that the League of Nations. And then you have a sparring partner.
Mhm.
Or you can replace that with Harry Kissinger. You put a lot of stuff from Harry Kissinger, and you try to. So in
Very
a sense,
interesting.
from that perspective, yeah, you can have a human who basically trains to be Harry Kissinger, but then in a couple of minutes you can actually train a bot to be Harry
That's
Kissinger and negotiate with him, and then adapt to or start. No, it's not perfect. It's still the beginning. And I played a little bit. I created the League of Nations, and there was another character which was not created by me. It was Machiavelli, which was created with uh,
Hmm.
a text from Machiavelli's book, Niccolo Machiavelli, and he
Right.
talked by Machiavelli. And what I've done, I put them in contact to converse with each other, the League of Nations with Machiavelli. And guess what? Because I was interested in the dynamic. And in 5 minutes, Machiavelli, Machiavelli was destroying the League of Nations. You are totally useless organization, and the tone, and totally useless. The war started, and the League of Nations was, Niccolo, calm down,
Unbelievable.
because So in this case, the chatbots. What I'm thinking is that you may use them as sparring partners to prepare for different contexts, whether it's a negotiation with the TAF or to and you need, as you do probably in real life, but now you have the opportunity, in a sense, to do that more effectively and to adapt to certain. And
Absolutely.
then you go to in-person negotiation. You don't need actually the AI tool. You already trained a little bit yourself for this kind of situation, different scenarios. What you'll do if you start a negotiation, someone starts yelling at you. You are an experienced diplomat, you know how to handle this, right? If you start yelling back, maybe it will work. But then you have to go through this kind of simulations. I mentioned it
Right.
because it was a negotiation a few years ago, and someone started intentionally to yell to off balance the interlocutor. But yeah, so you have to do a lot of training nowadays. You can do it in person with your, but now you have other tools to play
Very,
with it
very
historically.
interesting. It's like a sci-fi, I think. Very
No longer
unbelievable.
sci-fi. You used to consider sci-fi, but sci-fi now has become reality.
Right, right.
Many,
And
many.
uh, I'd like to ask you about ethical aspects of using AI in diplomacy. Do you think we should develop some ethical standards or ethical boundaries to use AI in diplomacy, or it is practically impossible?
Well, no, and that's a big question, right? Because um, that there are different ways to think about this, and it has
Mm,
been from the very beginning with social media, with AI, with everything. It applies the same thing. So remember, for instance, when people start using social media, they sometimes make mistakes. And that mistakes can be detrimental to the reputation of the country, to the reputation, and could basically end the diplomatic career. So how do you handle mistakes? It's not that the person, but sometimes what you say gets out of, you may say, well, I'm not going to do much. I'm going to stay very conventional, but in that case, you don't have impact. So what we see now with social media, and later you see Ministry of Foreign Affairs developing codes of digital practice.
mhm,
And that code of digital practice varies from institution to institution, depending on how risk averse versus risk tolerant is the institution. Institutions are different. They come with a historical makeup. Some of them are more risk averse, more rigid, more hierarchical, so they don't accept much in terms of mistakes. Others are okay, let's be creative and let's try to understand a little bit that. So that's one angle. What happens inside the institution, what kind of boundaries, what kind of rules it sets for its members in terms of the framework in which they can operate. There is a bigger issue nowadays with these technologies, how detrimental are to basically your own country. There is I don't know if the Digital Republic of Susskind that was published 2 years ago in which it speaks about this digital technology that actually could be seen as threat to democracy. And there is an entire debate about whether the technology are tilting the balance from democracy to authoritarianism. Surveillance becomes easier. The cost of surveillance becomes easier. You can immediately, and that if you are a democratic country and you allow this kind of technologies to operate freely, that's the reason for instance, the EU have adopted this EU AI Act, in which it tries to say, well, let's think about risks. What is risk, maximum risk? What is risk that is not acceptable? What is serious, severe risk? What is minimal risk? And in what areas we shouldn't take any action. So this kind of classification of areas. And then you have things that are set. The regulation was adopted, and we have the Digital Service Act as well. The test is now the implementation, and there are a number of investigations against Twitter, X, and TikTok open up recently. But you have to understand that once you do this, the idea of the splintered internet, we used to have this internet from the 90s, the entire global work, but I'm going to see probably different islands with different regulations, with different codes. Stricter, let's say, in the case of EU, less so in the case of United States, much stricter in the case of China, right? So that's the reason we hear more this new concept of digital sovereignty, in which different entities apply rules to the informational space or the text space in a particular way. So ethics is not, what I'm saying with this is that these ethical rules are not universal because countries, regions perceive them differently. What is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and they develop their rules that fit their moods or their moods of things. United States, they took a more laissez-faire type, but even then, for instance, see what's happening with TikTok, which is likely in a couple of weeks to be banned all over if they don't change the ownership. So there is a question here about how it affects you internally. I think the bigger question that we're going to see down the road, especially with AI, and there are discussions, it's what is not only about the society in which we live. This is where the concern is at the moment, that this technology creating a disruption that we cannot control, and it has on overall maybe more negative consequences than positive. But the next level of discussion on ethics and technology is the human level, about us, right? And there is an entire new literature developing about how digital technologies affect not only our capacity, human rights, and privacy, but also think about the discussion about brain interference of Musk, or a question that Meta is developing, not as intrusive of brain interference, but something that you can connect to your and understand better your feelings, and that's very interesting. The debate here is that as human species, we evolve naturally, organically over centuries. We have a particular cognitive capacity to understand by reading, by interpreting, by reasoning. But now we navigate into an ocean of data, which we cannot cope. Part of the reason that digital technology have become so problematic for many is that they cannot cope with so much. They are confused. What is true, what is not. So the idea with this kind of augmentation is that's a book of Kurzweiler, Raymond, the Singularity is Near, published this year, is that there is a temptation that technology will be the next leap for us in terms of human cognition, in which this kind of integration different tools in us, all of a sudden will allow us to be more cognizant, right, of interpreting with this kind of insertion in ourselves. That's an interesting debate. I don't think we are there yet, but the debate started. And with this kind of exponential growth, will be interesting, in 20 years, 30 years, where we be. And finally, there is this issue of whether technology will start working against us, not only because of providing disruption, but intentionally so. The AGI situation in which artificial intelligence becomes as smart as us or even smarter
controlling.
and take control. The Terminator scenario, Schwarzenegger Terminator. Well, we'll see whether that will happen. But these are three different layers of ethical concerns, four different layers of ethical concerns. At the level of institutions, how you operate, what kind of criteria. At the level of society, do you see more problems with this technology embedded, using them, destroying the fabric of the society and the democratic profile? To what extent we are moving into a direction in which we augment ourselves with in digital technologies in a more intrusive manner, more immersive, and then, of course, whether technology will look at us, from above and say, well, we are not particularly a nice species.
Yes. Well, I believe there are also those who think that digitalization of our life and diplomacy could lead to more democratization of diplomacy. But there is a debate. There are arguments from both sides.
I don't hear much. I heard a lot of this point in the past, but I don't hear much. Where I think we are entering now into a period of technological backlash, in which people are more afraid of technology. They are more than they are more optimistic. We lost trust. The keyword that I heard again, the buzzword that I heard in the past 3 months: trust. We trust technology. How to we used to trust technology, we used to trust science. 20 years ago, we thought, well, technology can help, can assist us, can do so. Now that trust has gone down, we see because of the dark side of, and you see the backlash. Australia has passed legislation banning the use of social media in certain for people under 16, and it's fighting with Musk in courts for that. There is a backlash against it, and this coming is growing. So I'm not trying to say that technology is going to open, golden age. That feeling, sort of 5-10 years ago, has moved to a different place, and the people are more cautious. Generally, those who know a little bit about this technology, more cautious about how things may move. And the backlash has started. We've seen backlash. Remember, Industrial Revolution, there was a backlash against the machines, and then, it started. But inevitably, after this kind of optimism and, positivity in confidence technology, there is a period of backlash. The question, how deep is this backlash? How endemic, how structural is going to be? And because the incentive is to keep pushing in order to gain an advantage, diplomacy, digital divide, and so on and so forth. But the backlash has already started.
Yeah, you use the word the dark side a couple of times. And I remember you and James Pament, you published a few years ago a book you edited, Countering Online Propaganda and Extremism, The Dark Side of Digital Diplomacy. So after the publication of this book, a few years later, do you think we see more dark side of this digitalization of diplomacy?
Absolutely. And that was the beginning. I mean, what is interesting nowadays is that it's so why do we see the dark side, the technology? Because it has become much easier to influence perceptions. So let's go back. How do you take decision in diplomacy? So if you are in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or a diplomat or even the minister, you have to have what is called situation awareness. What is happening, right? I have these countries that are my allies or my friends, and or those who are more hostile to me. So I have to take decisions on a daily basis. How do I take decisions? Based on information. Where this information coming from? My network of embassies, from my ambassadors, from others. Where else is coming from? What it's other reports that are prepared. So based on that, I take a decision, a course of action. This is how it works, right? Normally, it's been. Now, imagine that you change the context, the informational context on the basis of which you take decisions. So the information on which you use is being compromised. And that has been a game for a long time, compromised by planting fake information or, placing agents of influence in your circle. That has been done in the past. But nowadays, there is another circle. Another circle is at the level of society or the level of various interest groups. And that was a point that we're trying to cover in that dark side. Because then you have to react, especially in democratic regime, you have to react to a situation in which the public works against you, is being instigated to work against you. No, that's not your enemy. The enemy is this one. It put pressure from below to basically change. Think about Cambridge Analytica with Brexit, for instance. You operate in an environment, all the people knew that, those who understood that economic will be have a devastating effect. Nevertheless, you have created an environment to say, no, it's not going to happen. Everything will be the same. Nothing will change. So don't be fearful. Of course, that was totally wrong. But you create an environment and you create a cascade effect. Private actors, hostile actors, in which you change the way in which, on the basis of which you take decisions. So when with Hammond we looked at James, we looked at that, and that was more like a scratch, a first scratch into the what is happening at the moment is that the situation has become much worse. Why is that? Algorithms. Because algorithms basically, especially on those platforms that are not very fairly regulated, TikTok is one of them. You don't know what is happening. Meta, for instance, after the Cambridge Analytica, started to take some measures, to improve its image, but other platforms not. We don't know exactly what is happening on TikTok. We don't know what is happening on Telegram. And this Telegram now and TikTok are very much easy to use to change that context in which policymaker or diplomats take decision by introducing additional flow on a constant basis, exactly tailored to the profile of the user. So Alisher, if you are on TikTok and you look at the screen, it doesn't matter when you push the button like in the past with Facebook. It matters if you stop for a second or 3 seconds on a movie. 3 seconds will give the algorithm information that there is something that you liked about that find intriguing, and is going to give you more. It learns about you, even if you if you don't want to give information, it learns about it, and then it's going to give you more information on this side. And that's easy to, this is psychometrics, this is Cambridge Analytica stuff. This is how you basically tailored messages for Alisher profile and not for my profile. I may stop for 3 seconds a different movie. I'm going to give you information tailored to me based on that. So algorithms at the moment, have become very performant, and they are powered by AI, something that 5-6 years ago was not there. And that, again, it takes back to the problem of decisions, because when these kind of things happening, the traditional Ministry of Foreign Affairs is structured for the 18th century. If you are the
Right.
minister, you're going to call, hey, what is going on? And the other person is going to call the embassy. So that will take 2-3 days, or maybe half a day, depending on how fast you move, to figure out. So there is an asymmetry of the reaction time to certain events. So how do you react to this? Regulation is one thing. This is what's happening, but regulation comes at the cost, but will end up with the splintered internet, various regions with different digital sovereignty rules. But yeah,
So
it's an issue.
how to counter these dark trends? What to do with that?
First of all, you have to to realize that they are very serious. Right? I mean, with this kind of thing, people don't take them seriously sometimes. Well, when they look at the question of conflict, right? They say, well, conflict is the one with bombs and tanks and people dying. But this kind of algorithmic manipulation could be as bad as an attack with missiles, because it can change the direction of a country overnight in a particular way. So you have to be aware first that there is an issue, and there is a serious issue. That the fact that it doesn't show victims with bloods and buildings destroyed is not necessarily the case that you should let the guard down. That you have to be aware of that. And you have to develop capacity. There are countries that have good capacities. One that I mentioned, I wrote an article about Finland in the past on this, but the other one, James knows more, is on Sweden. Developed a psychological defense institute. James, I think, is working or collaborating with them in the past, which feels about the whole of society approach to this kind. You have to improve resilience. People have to understand to what is going on, how to protect themselves, and to adapt. And there is a role here, not if you want to protect your democracy, your country, and stay in your so it's slow work, but it's very, very important. It works, and that's something that we didn't necessarily understood probably at the beginning. The psychology, the cognitive psychology that is necessary to understand how algorithms impact us. That's the reason that Australia banned social platforms for teenagers. It fries their brains. It fries their brains. It creates social, and there have been books published on this. You have to understand, you have to protect. Regulation is one step. I think, you have to, in Finland, for instance, this is why I like this country, a small country, 5 million people, travel through various periods of adversity. So they're, very tough from this point of view. So they introduce, even at the level of the secondary school, 5 year in school, year 5, or even younger, to kids, how to courses, in addition to math, to literature, to history. They have courses about how to understand fake news, digital, part of the curriculum for young kids, to prepare themselves for life. And I think this is an important aspect, right? To understand, because it helps you. Otherwise, you are in the control of the algorithm. You understand well what is happening. You always be vulnerable. Ignorance is vulnerability. And this kind of technologies.
Right. So I have maybe a last question, maybe one or two. So how do you see diplomacy, let's say in 10, maybe 15 or 20 years? And also, can you please give a piece of advice to diplomats on using all these new digital technologies?
Well, indeed, and I think diplomacy in the next 10 years. I mean, it would be a very interesting. Diplomacy, when you think about it, is a very conservative and very established profession. And there
Mhm.
is a reason for that. When it started, to be institutionalized. I mean, Richelieu was the first, the Cardinal Richelieu, to establish the first Ministry of Foreign Affairs, 1626 in France. And the reason for him remains valid. Why do we need diplomacy? Before that, we said, well, states or kingdoms at that time, principalities have differences, and they ended up, settling the differences by military force. And Richelieu said, no, 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 continuous negotiations. We have to anticipate. We
Right.
need to place ambassadors at the courts of others to understand what is going on, to report back, so that any possible friction that may arise, and there will always be frictions, right? Interest, values, and so on. Any possible friction could be addressed in a timely fashion, and then hopefully, consequence or the possibility of war will be deviated, will be abandoned. And that, I think, it remains in many places. We need to um, understand how to address differences.
Mhm.
So that's a key element, right? I don't think that will be taken. The problem is how we're going to do this. We relied on human element, right? Building trust, a network with other people, relied on institutions, multilateral institutions, when people can, diplomats can work together on certain projects. To what extent diplomacy in the future is going to be only human, or you're going to see something that is more perform? I think it's going to be faster. You have to address problems as they arise. Are going to be powered, not replaced by technology, but assisted by technology, because you need, even in complex negotiations, right? You need to understand better different positions. And I've been playing with that a little bit in one case study. And you see already, for instance, this Zoom chat is going to be transcribed by AI, right? Imagine if we are not only two, we are 100. And then, with the AI, you get a real sense in real time of the positions of various parties, or summarize nuances, semantic analysis. So that type of assistant will be good.
Mhm.
At the same time, I believe that there is this human element that remains in place, in which you have to build relationship. Technology cannot necessarily help you building
Right.
relationships. They can suggest profiles, but then whether you can strike a relationship, develop a relationship with the person is based on the skill, is based on that the key element,
Yeah,
the human
emotion.
element of diplomacy that you know much better than me, of course, through your practice and studies, that it's unlikely to go away. I remember speaking about Kissinger. Advising Nixon before going to China how to negotiate with Chairman Mao at that time. And he said, well, it's very important to understand that Chairman Mao, comes with this kind of background, has this kind of hot buttons. This is how you should react. This is how you should ignore. Certain elements of that, I think can be provided the moment by AI, but how you implement them, I can help you much. So implementation of those points, it depends to you, the skill, the way to build a relationship, the way to build confidence, the way to move to the next stage, how to start, what kind of topics. So there is a lot of preparation that technology can help. This is what I'm trying to say. But once that preparation, it's, you have the insight, you have the brief from that, right? How you apply that, it's a human element that it's difficult and probably impossible to replace. So I'm confident that we'll see more technology-assisted diplomacy. It's inevitable. We're going to that point. I think we're going to see more alongside state actors, more non-state actors involved in diplomatic like these kind of tech companies that are, they have force, there's power. We've seen the recognition of that with the rise of tech ambassadors, which are
Yeah.
about 26 of them nowadays, and which try to negotiate with rising new centers of power. So that's another element that we have to. It will be interesting if Jan Bremer is right. Whether are we slipping into this technopolar moment in which tech companies becoming like states? That's an idea in the sense sovereign like states in which they don't care. I mean, you have to deal with them like you deal. Are we going to see OpenAI getting a seat in the UN Security Council? I don't know. Will remain to be seen. So these are things that look how to prepare, for the young diplomats. I think the good thing about the young diplomats is that they grow up with this kind of tools, as we used to grow up probably in the 90s and 80s, with other type of with the PC, for instance, right? Now
Right.
they grow up with this kind of apps. But I think it's becoming imperative, basically, to be very well versed and literate in technology. I mean, my advice for anyone is you have this kind of tech newsletters from various institutions. Presenting you very briefly, even Politico has, what is new in terms of AI technology policy and governance. Every week it gives you a newsletter with new developments. That you need to read that. You need to read that in order to stay abreast with what is new developments. We have to understand that we have to understand that technology doesn't affect how diplomacy is being conducted, whether you do this negotiation or public diplomacy or crisis management, but also it puts new issues in front of you for negotiation. All this discussion about digital sovereignty, it's a topic that you need to negotiate with others. If you don't understand what it is, digital sovereignty, you go there blindly, you have no idea. You need to negotiate ethical rules, how they apply to digital technologies.
Yes.
I was talking with one of the tech ambassadors some time ago, and I said, well, part of your mission, what it is. Part of the mission is the same. It's also they ask my advice when my country does trade agreements. You mean, and I said digital trade agreements? No, common trade agreements, because now everything has data in it. A car, for instance, is full of data with the GPS and all the navigation system and so on, and how the data is being used in the car, right? Comes with, is it does it comply with GDPR or not? That type of thing. So everything you have to stay abreast. So it's not only to play with TikTok or that's good in terms of understanding what is that, but there is a much bigger picture here of understanding trends, doing horizon standard scanning, pay attention to developments, position of various countries, new formats that are being developed. The TTC, the Trade Technology Council, which was created by the EU with United States in 2021. The EU now uses this kind of format in which they negotiate digital and technology stuff also with India. There is also a new format of digital partnership with Japan. So there is a new, let's say, area of diplomacy, which is not separate, but it's data diplomacy, data agreements, which areas in which you have to learn. And I think the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has also a responsibility to inform and to train exactly on this issue. What is new? How does it affect us? What should you pay attention when you are sent to a mission, aside from the traditional stuff? Yeah, so it's an exciting area for diplomacy. I think I wouldn't, but
Very challenging also.
it's very challenging, yeah, because it's continuously evolving.
Well, Corneliu, it's such an unbelievably interesting discussion. You provided absolutely fantastic, but also very realistic picture. And it is just, I felt from time to time that partly I was in the next century. So, but it happening now, as you mentioned. So thank you so much. I think we could see this also a kind of warning bell. So it is exciting, fantastic, very interesting, nice things, but also very dangerous, very unpredictable things might happen and already happening. So thank you so much. I wish you all the best. Please continue your wonderful journey in the world of digital technologies. You have to say so many interesting and useful things. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alisher. Thank you again for having me, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak on this issue, which, as you may see, I'm quite passionate about them, and I
Yes,
found it
yes.
quite exciting in terms of developing in the field, but also, general evolution of global affairs.
Right, right.
Thanks again.
Thank you.